Hey creative friends, it's Gwen. Yes, creating clusters for your layouts can be tricky. What if I told you there was a simple way that you could create perfect clusters every time? A way that would work even without understanding the rules of composition and balance. This was the one technique that I used a lot when I first started creating, and I want to share with you exactly how it works. The first thing you'll want to do is find examples of clusters that you love. Find several examples in different sizes and different styles. The more options you have here, the better. Don't pay too much attention to the specific elements that are used, so the colors or the brand of the embellishments. What you're looking for here is actually just the cluster design. Seek out the clusters that you want to have on your layouts. You can find examples on Pinterest or a Google search, and I'm more than happy for you to use my pages as examples. Now the secret is super simple. We are going to convert these embellishment clusters into templates. So yes, copying what works is my big trick, but that's not all I'm going to share today. Stick around because we're going to work through this together and I'll share my tips and tricks along the way. I've pulled out a few layouts to share with you, starting with this one here, and we are going to replicate that top cluster there. There are a few ways that you can go about doing this, and I'm going to start with the simplest one first. What you'll need to do is find supplies that match as closely as you can to the cluster that you're copying. Not the exact same brand or color, but the type of embellishment. So for example, the cluster that I'm copying here starts with 2 tags. So I'm going to find 2 tags in a collection that I love that I can use for this cluster. So in this example, I have a larger tag on the left and a smaller tag on the right. I then have this heart embellishment. So that is actually one that I have punched using a paper punch. And then underneath the heart there, I have some floral elements. Don't be afraid if it looks different, because it will, because you're not using exactly the same supplies, but your cluster will have a similar feel about it. Down the left-hand side, there is a rectangular sentiment. So I found one in the collection that I'm using to match. Similar size, similar width, so it's going to work really well. Following along with the cluster on the left, there is an extra sentiment underneath that main one, so I am going to position that, and that's the bones of the cluster really in place, and it's from here that I can start to add my own twist to it, and I can make some choices about embellishments that better suit what I'm working with. And here's a good example of that. The cluster on the left has those orange florals that are traveling more towards the top of the page, so actually quite vertically. The cluster that I have, I felt didn't need that. I felt like it needed florals that would flow slightly more out towards the left-hand edge. So I am copying the elements within the cluster, same for same. Florals with florals, tags with tags, but I am making adjustments as I go. You can see here that I'm pointing out all of the individual elements and they are the same, but the cluster looks quite different. Can you see how you're taking the cluster design and then using that for your page? You can see the end result of something that you know works and then adapt it to your layout. For this next cluster, we're going to take this idea to the next level. This time around, instead of replacing same with same, you've got some extra flexibility to switch elements up. So for example, I did not have a large tag element to start with, so I have started with a journaling card. As you switch things out in your cluster, you will notice that it looks a little bit different from the one that you're copying. You've got more creative freedom, but what will happen is you'll have to make some more creative choices on your own. It can even get to the point where you're no longer able to copy the original cluster, but that's actually a good thing. It's in those moments that you'll be learning the skills you need to create clusters on your own. When you get to this space, just keep these 3 three things in mind. Don't be afraid to cover things up. You are creating a layered embellishment cluster here, so to get that layered look, you actually have to layer things on top of each other. You can see at this point in this cluster, I'm also mixing and matching the size of things. So I have used a round element on the left there, but my round element is much smaller than the one in the cluster that I'm copying. The second thing you need to keep in mind is the outside edge of the cluster. I talk about this quite a lot in my videos. You want to make that outside edge really interesting. It's actually the secret to making a cluster look more complicated and more detailed than it really is. The third thing to remember is audition and practice. Very rarely do I grab an element and place it down and it's in the perfect position. Very rarely. And I've been doing this for quite a while. I really love to audition elements and test things out because every time you do that, you learn a little bit more about what works and what doesn't. I wasn't sure what to add down the bottom here, so I went back to my reference cluster and saw that there was a little element down in the bottom corner of the circle. I'm going to add a heart for this one. And here you can see all of the individual elements. So they're all there, but I have switched things out as I've gone along. Let's make one more cluster using this technique. And then I can share with you a whole new idea that builds on this. I'm going to recreate the cluster here on the bottom right-hand side. I'm going to start with the tag and build this cluster outwards from there. I'm going to replace same with same where I can, but where I can't, where I don't have those embellishments in my collection, I'm just going to mix and match things. As you do this more and more, you might find that you just need a jumping off point. You might only need to place the first, say, 2, 3, or 4 elements, and then you'll be off and running. Sometimes getting started is the hardest part, so I found this really helps. I also wanted to let you know that this video is actually going to be part of a much longer series that I'm going to do on clusters. Turns out I've got a lot to say about how to create clusters, and I didn't want to overwhelm you by putting it all in one video. I want to give you simple ideas that you can put to use straight away, and then we can build on those together. So if you haven't already subscribed, make sure that you do so you don't miss those next videos. I also wanted to mention here that I actually find it much easier to create a cluster when it's on a layout. I have seen creatives do like batch clustering and make up a bunch of clusters and have them ready to go for a page, but I personally find it much easier to work with what I already have going on with a layout. I find the flow of the layout will actually help with the flow of the cluster, but that's a whole separate another video. The reason I bring it up though is if you are a beginner or you really want to just focus on your clusters, I would absolutely do them as part of your creating process. I wouldn't sit down and do them the way that I'm doing them here. I would do them as part of your normal creating. I think you'll find it so much easier that way. So this one is coming together quite nicely. I did feel like it needed a little bit of height, and I have just replicated a die cut that I've used right there. And that's feeling so much better. See how similar it is to the cluster that I copied? All of the elements are there, but you know what I'm missing? A bow. I'm all about them bows, so we better add one of those. That's so much better. Now, on to this second big idea that I have for you. You may be familiar with layout sketches, but did you know that you can sketch out embellishment clusters too? So all you need to do is find a cluster that you like and then draw in the shapes of that cluster. So for example, this one has 2 circular elements and then some floral elements around it. I'm not sketching the layout, I'm only focused on that embellishment cluster. I'm going to include all the details, including the enamel dots, because I really like their position. Here's another example. This one starts with a large tag at the base. It then flows upward and to the right with some floral elements and some circular shapes. There is a large heart that I'm going to include as well. Focus on the basic shapes within the cluster and also focus on the proportions. So if an element is quite large, make sure that you draw it in a way that matches the cluster. I am actually going to go all the way to the top of the layout for this one. This is quite a large cluster. Now you can treat these exactly the same way that you would treat a scrapbook sketch. I store mine in this notebook with other layout sketches and inspiration. I actually find that sketching out the cluster can really help you see the clear lines in it. It can help you to see the individual elements and how they work together. It breaks a complicated cluster down into chunks and then you can replicate it step by step. So let's build this bottom one together so you can see how this all works. I'm going to start with a rectangle for the bottom and it's going to be a combination of a die cut piece and a tag. I have a round element that I'm going to add here. It is just punched from a paper punch. My sketch tells me I need some floral elements on the left, but because I'm not adding this to a physical page, I need something to anchor that onto. So I am going to use this tag here. That's part of the problem of not doing this on an actual layout. If this idea is new to you, I would go ahead and create a bunch of sketches, maybe even 5 to 10, and then keep them aside. When you're creating, then you'll have something to reference. You'll be able to choose one that fits with the flow of your layout, and then you'll have something that you can copy directly onto your page. I am going to build out the floral cluster at the top here, and I also did find the perfect sentiment for down the bottom. So that's exactly as it is shown on my sketch. I'm sure many of you have used sketches in the past for your full layouts, and these work in the same way in that they can be flipped and rotated and changed up in the same way that the full page sketches can be. So while you can stay really close to the sketch, know that you can also mix things up. As I go, I'm also going to add in the other things that we normally talk about when I talk about scrapbooking. So dimension, so some of the elements might be added with foam tape rather than flat to the page, and also texture. Also things like color balance, which was why I switched out that blue flower for the pink one. Super happy with how that's looking, but I did notice that it didn't have that flow upwards that the cluster does have in the sketch. So I am going to add a floral element here somewhere at the top. This also goes back to what I was saying about layering. I know that a lot of that pretty flower I'm not going to see. It's just going to be the leaves of the edges that are going to poke through, and I have to be okay with that. So referencing back to the sketch, I realized that I was missing a circular element. Adding a flare button will solve that problem, and it will also add some texture to my cluster. Here's a close-up look at all of the details in the clusters that I've made today. Let me know in the comments if you're going to give these a try, and if you have any questions at all, I'm more than happy to help. Now that you've learned this simple technique, you are now ready to learn the cluster cake method, which I share in this video right here. Be sure to check it out, and I'll see you all again very soon. Until then, bye!